Hi, I'm Mary Spencer. I'm in very rainy Toronto today, but we're going to Florida to talk to Maria Puerta. We're going to San Luis Obispo, California to talk to Robert Schaeffer. We're going to, where is it, Jim Ranney? Where you're in Philadelphia, are you?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So we'll travel around a bit. And here in Toronto with me is Doug Saunders. Of course, he's not with me, but he's in Toronto, and I guess he's getting rained on too. Hi, folks. How are you today? You all okay? Terrific. Let's plunge right into it because there's a lot on our minds. I did a little go around first a minute ago to find out what people are thinking about. And Maria says she's been crying all morning because she's been watching the hearings of the January the 6th insurrection, and everybody's upset. So let's start off by having Maria tell us what's going on, because it certainly is a heavy issue.
Today has been very tough. I think it's difficult to just set apart the political part of it and the emotional part of it. The select committee on the January 6th insurrection started today. The hearings with 4 police officers involved in the riot at the Capitol, and it has been very emotional. But also because we are watching again and again the videos, so it's been painful. There have been a couple of testimonies. One from Representative Kinzinger, who is a Republican. He cried. He just cried. And the other testimony that I thought was very powerful was from, I live in Florida, today is rainy, by the way, and one of our representatives, Congresswoman Murphy, I think it was just devastating, her opening remarks, because she's not giving a testimony, but her opening remarks were just devastating. So I'm kind of trying to keep it together because I've been for the past 3 weeks following the crisis in Cuba and my own country, Venezuela's crisis. So I think I'm on a roller coaster in terms of how hard it is to first defend democracy and to differentiate who are the ones who have the power to defend democracy and why are we allowing them to subvert this principle of respect for law and respect for human rights. I think I can't differentiate right now what's happening here with the Republican Party and what's happening in Latin America, because it's not just Cuba and Venezuela, it's Nicaragua also. And as Robert mentioned, Haiti is another problem. But I think Haiti is Western Hemisphere's fault. It's awful what's happening there, but it's also awful that we have just ignored Haiti and just let them figure out for themselves what to do without any help. So I think these are issues that I've been writing about, some of it, not all of it. And I don't think that's enough. I think there has to be more. We've done a couple of things in a group that I work with other colleagues. We've done some, we've issued statements about some organizations ignoring what's happening in Cuba, but that no one is paying attention. Everyone is focused on the embargo and not on the dictatorship. So it's very difficult to establish a conversation based on that. It's just, I'm not ignoring that the embargo is critical, but it is a dictatorship. It's an authoritarian regime. So let's not just move away from that. Let's talk about both. I think we can agree on embargoes being very inefficient for regime change. I've written about that too. But dictatorships usually find a way to victimize themselves with this. So it's very convenient for Venezuela and Cuba to have an embargo. It's good for them. It keeps those powerful authoritarian men in a narrative that they are the victims and the bad guys are the ones who are violating human rights, for example. which is absurd. But this is just my kind of broad image of what I'm following.
Robert, I think you said that you were hoping that Maria would talk about Cuba and Venezuela, her home country, and let's not forget Haiti. What are your thoughts about what's going on? And by the way, everybody should feel free to interrupt everybody else. I'm not like controlling with a gavel or something.
I thought she raised an interesting question about the role. How can people sort of create peace or work for peace in situations of sort of utter economic and political collapse? I mean, Venezuela went from earning about $90 billion a year in oil to now it earns about $2 billion. I mean, people have described the collapse as bigger than the collapse of, the economy in the Soviet Union during World War II. I mean, so that's the scale of things. And Cuba, of course, has been ground down for many years, the economy and so on, and it's in a desperate state and so on. So, but one thing that I'm curious about is that one thing that happens when states collapse and so on is there's a massive migration. So out of Cuba, we've had these waves of migration. Out of Venezuela, there's a huge migration during the collapse in the 2000s and early teens. And then after COVID, people are being forced back into Venezuela. And so there's these huge migratory diaspora expatriate communities, and they play very different political roles. I mean, in Cuba, the expats in the diaspora in Florida is notoriously anti-communist, hysterical, and they're unlike any other Hispanic immigrant population in the United States. So Puerto Ricans, for example, are not that way. the Puerto Ricans who live in the United States, nor are Mexicans or Central Americans in the West. So the diaspora community plays a very weird and interesting role. In Venezuela, I know less about it, but I'm curious about it because immigrant diaspora groups can play and have played in other contexts an important role in peacemaking. They have a kind of a check and a balance. They're active, engaged. They raise money. Sometimes it's bad stuff. I mean, some of remember the Cuban terrorist, right-wing terrorist organization, but sometimes, if you think about the role that diaspora community plays in Palestine, Israel, and so on, it's a very complicated thing. So I'm used as someone who's been intimately involved and know those different kind of diaspora communities. I'm curious what Maria thinks about the progressive role that diaspora communities can play or are playing in defending democracy, promoting economic development, human rights, and so on.
You've introduced something that we've discussed this before, Meta, right? Last year I had to write about the Venezuelan American diaspora here in Florida because they played a very important role in the election, just like the Cuban American electorate. I'm a resident, so I still I'm not allowed to vote yet, but I participated in some political activities. One of the problems that I think has contributed to this tension in terms of domestic politics here in Florida. I live in Orlando, so things are really tough in South Florida when it comes to Latino politics, because Cuban Americans and now Venezuelan Americans, along with Nicaraguan Americans, are very, very opposed to Democrats in terms of their foreign policy regarding Latin America. So the pressure they put and the antagonism with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, it has made, that's why Trump won, not just among them, but also Mexican Americans in Texas. He won by wide margins that Latino vote. Puerto Ricans are different because, first of all, they tend to vote Democrat, although Trump made some inroads with them here in Central Florida. Where I live is a stronghold. It's a Democratic stronghold, and it's mostly because of Puerto Ricans when it comes to the Latino vote. But Trump made some inroads. because there's also this, I wrote about this last year. There's this tiny detail that I think we should also include in this conversation, which is the religious identity of these groups. These are mostly evangelicals, and that plays a huge part in their political identity. So it's not, there's this mistake here in America and the United States that people think that all Latinos are liberals or progressives, and that's the total opposite. Most are moderates or conservatives. So I think the electorate in South Florida identified with Trump because of his rhetoric against Cuba and Venezuela, the regimes. So he promised a lot of things, he didn't deliver, but people still voted for him. So that is a contrast with other groups that are not that representative and are more moderate. I'm not going to say they're fully progressive, but they're more centrist. And those are in the minority in the Democratic Party. So what I see is that right now what we're going through in South Florida is a very strong push for more forceful sanctions. They're putting pressure on the Biden administration. So there is, I don't know what else they can do, because they basically used everything in the toolbox of sanctions against Venezuela. And because that's the other problem. It's not just Venezuela alone or Cuba alone. It's like both countries need to be treated with a certain policy that fits this narrative that whatever happens in Cuba is going to have an effect in Venezuela and vice versa. So I think that's important. So the Cuban American and Venezuelan American electorate in South Florida, they are very powerful. They fundraise for many House seats. So that's the other aspect of this. It's not just the presidency, the White House. It's also the Senate. It's the House. So this is really important because the Democratic Party lost 2 seats in this 2020 election. And for 2022, we're just expecting the House to be again on the Republican side. So, and the Mexican American vote is different. They tend to be more conservative. And that would explain why Trump did really good in the Texas border with Mexico. It was impressive even for him, because there's this notion that for some Latino electorate, it's not working for them to be identified as a minority. Many of them don't identify as Latino, they identify as white. So that has also played a role in this whole electoral debate about why Biden lost the Latino vote in these congressional districts.
Why do they identify as white? And what does it mean if they do? I don't know the implication of that.
There's a race issue among Latinos that is not sufficiently discussed. We don't like to talk about race. That's a very American thing. But among Latinos, we usually avoid the conversation because there's a lot of inter-racism among Latinos. We have Black Latinos. We have mixed race. But we also have white Latinos who don't identify as Latinos because they want to be considered what they are in terms of race. And that's a problem because it's a mix of the ethnicity with the race. And
well, are you saying that they would go so far as to identify what in any degree with these white supremacist neo-Nazi, thugs who are really the basis for, well, what you've been watching today, the January 6th event? Are you saying these white or self-styled white Latinos are anywhere near that kind of orientation?
Well, I'll give you one example. The leader of the Proud Boys is a Cuban who is Black. And he's the leader of the Proud Boys.
He's black?
A white supremacist group. Yes,
He's
he is.
black. Okay.
He's Afro-Cuban.
What does he say when questioned about this strange identity?
No, you think he's white.
Okay. Sorry,
I've
I'm
seen
deflecting you from.
I've seen that. And it's crazy, but it makes sense for them because they don't want to be treated like a minority. I'm going to share with you the article because I got a lot of criticism for that article.
Really?
And I'm afraid we, among Latinas, we are not convinced that we have to have this conversation about racism among Latinas. So what I've found, because there's a lot of Cuban American, Venezuelan Americans that are from European descent. So they are not mixed. It's true. But they are Latinos. And they don't appreciate the connotation of Latino as a minority. So they refuse to identify as Latinos because they don't want to be treated like they're less American than a full white Anglo-Saxon Christian American. So it's part of I'm framing it as part of the cultural assimilation. Maybe I'm wrong, but so far what I've found, there's a lot of whitening among Latinos. So I think we have to consider that when it comes to voting here. But I wanted to just quickly to close my response to Robert. It's about the migration. Yes, there's been a huge Cuban immigration in the US, but the Venezuelan migration is over the 5 million number. It's probably going to hit 6 million by next year. And we're spread all over the world, but mostly in South America. And it's taking a toll on those economies that are already hurt because of the pandemic. So we're going to have a crisis. We're already having a lot of Cubans and Venezuelans trying to cross the border illegally. I came in an airplane with a visa and plane ticket. And so there are so many differences between Venezuelans in terms of the ways they are leaving the country. I left the country because I had a conference here and I decided to stay after. But it's becoming overwhelming for the whole continent because Canada and the US, they receive migrants, but not as much as Colombia and other countries. So and about the oil collapse, it started when Hugo Chavez fired most of the industry. This is just the consequence of people blame Maduro, and I understand because he's the one who's showing face. But this started with Chavez. This is not only Maduro's fault. This is a political project, and that's what Chavez wanted. So he's just executing his political will. So that's my take.
Thank you. Doug, you did a column a few weeks ago in the Globe and Mail about what the U.S. should do vis-a-vis Cuba.
I think one of the problems with both Democrats and Republicans is that when there is a mass uprising in a Latin American country, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela, they instinctively feel that the best response is to help, is to come in and support the protesters, sometimes in the case of Venezuela, with direct military intervention. And I think there's an inability in Washington to see how this is perceived and what the sort of perverse end effects of this are. I mean, I think you could legitimately say that Venezuela would be in a much better place now if American authorities had not decided to have it heavy-handedly come in, regardless of what the political orientation is of the diaspora community in the United States. And I think Maria speaks to an important, aspect of this, is that the Cuban diaspora community and some of the Venezuelan diaspora community, a a lot of Venezuelans living in the United States and in Canada see themselves as being refugees from Maduro and Chavez, and not just from the economic circumstances created by them. So the voices that are heard by politicians in the United States tend to be those who say, come on, get in there, help out, this is happening, without the recognition that within those countries, even democratic-minded people who are opposed to the regime in Cuba, who are opposed to the regime in Venezuela, do not want the United States getting involved. And this is aside from the question of whether the US embargo against Cuba contributes to this problem. But the US embargo in Cuba, as Maria said, is unpopular in Cuba, even among people who don't like the regime. And in fact, you could argue, there's persuasive arguments that the regime has lasted decades longer than it otherwise would have, because it has managed to, under Castro, it managed to channel anger at the impoverishment and lack of freedom created by the regime into anger at the United States for these things. So the strategically intelligent thing to do in Washington is to say, we would like this Cuban popular uprising to succeed. And in order for it to succeed, we need to stay out of it. We need to step back and not be seen as being involved, which is just not part of American political dialogue in either party. This notion that there's a sort of Heisenberg principle involved in that your involvement in something that you think is good will cause it to no longer have a good outcome. So I would like to think that there's better hope for this. It was interesting with the Venezuelan situation under the Trump administration, that a lot of the other democracies, particularly of the Americas, got together and formed meetings and organizations in order to get around the United States and attempt to assist the Venezuelan people without the United States getting involved, so that the other democracies could dissociate themselves from Trump. And I think that was a helpful beginning of a mechanism. But now it's tricky because everybody wants to work with the United States. It's got a decent government now. But their messaging around bringing democracy to Cuba and Venezuela and other countries hasn't necessarily changed.
I think both those comments, or discussions, were really illuminating and accurate, and based on everything I've read and stuff, I think it's very thoughtful. So I think that staying out by staying out is good. The role that immigrants play, and I think I liked you calling attention to the resistance to being categorized as a racial ethnic minority by people who are trying to kind of get assimilated in the United States and so on. I think that's a very useful thing to think about, and to think that part of the problem, and I think that raises, is there's a tendency by the Democrats and to some extent the Republicans to treat Latinos as a homogenous group. The term Latino suggests, they're all the same, from the Philippines to Grenada, and they're very different politically and socially and ethnically and and so on. They have very different politics. Two island nations very close to each other, Puerto Ricans and Cubans, are very different in their, and to call them Latinos is to kind of muddy a lot of the water. And so I think that's a very useful and helpful thing.
The problem is that they don't know how to interpret us. So it's easier for them to, first it was Hispanic, then when that didn't work, okay, Latinos, but still, Puerto Ricans are US citizens. And yet some people here are basically ignoring that fact. Starting with Trump, he didn't know that. And there you have it. So it's, I do agree on being the default reaction to any crisis in the Americas, especially in Latin America, that everyone turns to the US and you gotta do something like Duque yesterday or the day before about declaring Venezuela a terrorist state sponsor. I guess that's a huge problem, but I would just make, this kind of, you have to differentiate. Trump was a very, he didn't know anything about, being president. So he didn't know much about politics, foreign policy. He had no idea, no background. He didn't know where Venezuela was. He didn't know what was going on there. So I think he understood because some lawmakers made this case to him. You gotta do something about Venezuela because we have a lot of vote down there. And that's not just Venezuelan votes, which are basically 2%. We're talking about the Cuban and Nicaraguan and Colombian American votes. So you need to do something about that. It was just a proxy. And it worked. It worked just fine because on the 2016 election, it didn't win the Venezuelan American vote. It was Hillary. And then he quickly turned that around. Now, the other thing is that Trump was never going to invade Venezuela. He knew that. He was pulling out from Iraq and Afghanistan. So why would you think he would really, that was part of my argument with those Venezuelans who supported him. They really, really thought he was going to invade Venezuela. That was ridiculous. He was never going to do that. And Biden, forget it. The Democrats will never do that. He's pulling out in effect from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think we just have to come to terms with the fact, for those who are pushing for that, it's not going to happen.
I'm interested in the question beyond the immediate question of the United States right now of when governments should decide that a popular protest movement or uprising against a regime is something worth supporting. And I think aside from the Americas, yesterday, there was a de facto coup in Tunisia, in which the president suspended parliament and ousted the prime minister, which had a lot of support among the Tunisian diaspora because the government is very unpopular. It has Islamist ties. It's not very nice. And nobody's sad to see them go. But on the other hand, it's a coup. History says, it was a democratically elected government. So it was a coup. A coup is never a good thing, regardless how bad the government is. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the mass protests in Cuba, which nobody would call a democratically legitimate government, but it becomes a question of to what extent are the protesters representative of the population? If there is a democratic transition somehow, will this actually be the public? And in the middle, you have Venezuela, I think, where while you could say the Chavez regime was at least at first had democratic legitimacy, the Maduro regime is very questionable, and there's a legitimate case to be made that they were not a legitimate government, and that something needed to be done about that by the public. So aside from the question of whether the United States specifically should, but what's the point? What's the threshold where you say, okay, this protest movement is the legitimate voice of this country?
Well, I have a thought about it, and it's not really about what criteria should be involved in making that decision objectively, but more how to understand the mentality of my peace-oriented friends. Peace workers are more susceptible than the average, I think, to thinking along the lines that Doug was apprehensive about. That is to say, if the U.S. is involved, that proves that whoever the U.S. supports has to be a bad policy, a bad regime, or a bad movement. And I see this with respect to Venezuela. I would probably guess, I don't really know, that the majority of my peace-minded activist friends in Canada would support Maduro. I just as in fact, most of my friends actually supported Fidel, which I don't understand that either. People who believe in democracy, etc., who know that he's a dictator, who was a dictator, they would agree, yeah, he's a dictator, but he's a good one. And that was a very prevalent perspective. And even, I see people justifying China now. I must be a lone figure someplace out of the mainstream, because I would say almost the majority of my friends on international affairs would come down on maybe a different side than I would about, let's say, Hong Kong, or maybe even the Uyghurs. People saying, well, maybe they're not really mistreating the Uyghurs as badly as they claim to be, et cetera. So I hear this and I think, you're my pals. You're supposed to be on my side, and you're not. And I don't understand that. And I think that it may be that because the Canadian government is not. I'm on the side of the Canadian government on vis-a-vis at least Venezuela, and also China, more or less. The government is supported by, I presume, the majority of the Canadian population on these issues, insofar as they have a view at all. And so I'm saying then that I think peace activists are more to the left, whatever that means, but it doesn't. It's a crazy kind of categorization when it comes to trying to decide when to support human rights and democracy in other countries. So tell me where I'm, am I right in my analysis of this differential? And if so, what's the real explanation for it? Because I don't really get it.
I think, Meta, that's a very astute thing to say. The left and the peace community and stuff has long been enamored of jerks around the world. 10 years ago, I wrote a book, I'll show it here, called Red Ink, Dictatorship of the Development of Capitalism in China, which was very critical of the dictatorship and the regime and stuff, and the U.S. partnership with it and so on. And the book was incredibly ignored and despised. People wouldn't review it because the left community of the United States was very, Maoist in its orientation, sort of at a deep level, and they thought that the Maoist, the Cultural Revolution was an important and a revolutionary event instead of the reactionary, vulgar, keep the same people in power sort of movement that it was. So that's a big problem. The interesting thing, of course, is that the Republicans made the bid to China in the first place, Nixon and then the Republicans, and then they were joined later by Clinton and the Democrats, and then Trump was the first person who, well, he didn't read my book, but he could have. His attitude toward China was very critical and quite demonstrative. The interesting thing is Trump did change the nature of relations with China, and China itself did with Xi and his whole sort of reassertion of, the authoritarian Maoist kind of rule. But the interesting thing is Biden has picked it up so that now the Democrats and the Republicans agree on very little, but they do agree on China, and they do agree actually on antitrust. But they do agree on China that, and they're developing it's like a whole new kind of relationship with that, which actually I support. Most of my, as you say, your left friends, your peacenik friends and stuff, but China and globalization and stuff is all good and so on. Well, not for workers in Pittsburgh and not for the Uyghurs or the people in Hong Kong. So that's a big change. I welcome that change, but of course, what that means in terms of globalization is that China was one of the key elements of making globalization happen. And when you take that relationship, that special relationship between the United States and China, both economically and politically away, then one of the key features of economic political globalization we've known for the last 40 years has changed. That foundation, that whole relationship is up for grabs, and a whole new thing is developing. Which is why I say that we're in a period of after globalization, because that's a central component. There were other central foundations of globalization too, monopolization, outsourcing in China, and then also technology. But China was really central. So that's all changed, and that's, but that puts, people on the left in an odd position, because people and academics have long been supportive of that relationship, and I think they're kind of at sea in terms of kind of what to do or what to make of that change.
Well, a lot of times I think they just plain don't remember that China is really a capitalist society now. I have old lefty friends who really think that Russia is still a communist country. And that the reason and they accuse me of being anti-communist, and therefore that's the reason I'm critical of Putin is because I'm anti-communist. You figure that one out.
No, yeah. Yeah, well, that's odd.
I just bought your book, Robert, because I need to write something about China.
Oh, good.
About digital authoritarianism. So I hope it helps me.
Yeah, it was 10 years ago, so I didn't have a lot of stuff on the digital, but it has, yeah.
Yeah, but I need to write it for the background. I think it's going to be good for it.
Oh, good. A sale. Hooray.
Well, here, let's let you flog your new book, because you've got one in press now, which I even don't know the title of. Yeah, okay.
So the new book is called After Globalization, a Crisis and Disintegration. So that's where Venezuela comes in, and Africa and so on.
Do you already have it on Amazon? Oh,
so
here it is.
It's coming up. It'll be out in September. So it's Routledge.
September. Okay.
And
I like this one.
What it is basically is it's a look at the origins of globalization 40 years ago in basically 1980, and then its kind of rise, the various crises, the rise of China, and so on. And then it's economic crisis in the Great Recession, and then COVID, and the political response to it. So it looks at the political reaction to globalization, which also undermines and transforms the relationships, the Tea Party and Trump, but also Brexit in England and in Europe and so on, and situations in the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and Africa. I don't say a lot about Latin America, but it kind of looks at that kind of total history. And the basic argument is that in the 1980s, for various reasons that were not understood at the time, the U.S. government made money available to Wall Street, and Wall Street began to boom from 700 in 1982 to 35,000 today. So that creates a stock price inflation. And the thing about stock price inflation is that, your stock prices are going up, but it puts enormous pressure on businesses to increase the bottom lines to keep up with the Dow Joneses. And if they can't keep up, they get fired. So they have to develop strategies to increase profits. And there's 3 ways to do that they found out. One is you monopolize like crazy and you abandon antitrust law. Second is you outsource, first to Mexico, then to other places. Then everybody goes to China. So China is central in the outsourcing thing. And the third is technology to increase productivity. And so the computer revolution is part of that, and developing new technologies to increase labor productivity. So those all have global ramifications. And so basically the US stock market became the capitalist engine of accumulation and global social change. And that works, except that the stock market crashes every 10 years and wipes people out, and destroys East Asia in Southeast Asia in 1997, and Russia in 1998, and there's all this Mexico several times, this collateral damage and stuff, and then people move to China even more so because other places have to. Anyway, so you create these crises, then you have the Great Recession, and then you begin to get which is a crisis of capitalism. I mean, nearly a heart attack, basically equivalent. And then you get a political response to it of people, both the left and the right. You have Bernie Sanders and the old anti-free trade people who met in Seattle in 1999, and you have the Tea Party people who hate anybody, taking their taxes for other things. Welfare chauvinism is what they call it in Europe. And you get the Brexit responses and so on. And those begin to challenge globalization, because the consequences for workers in the core countries of globalization outsourcing is, deindustrialization and poverty and no increasing wages, and declining standards of living, and women going to work and trying to keep households together. Okay, so all that stuff is a real problem. So then it begins to break down, and then Trump, and then COVID, and so on. But what's interesting is that there's two kinds of anti-globalization. There's the anti-globalization to the right of Trump, the nationalists and stuff, and people in Europe, France first, Poland first, Hungary first, kind of people. And then there's the left. The right in recent years has been more successful with Trump and the Tea Party and the Brexit folks and Labor, the conservatives and so on. But there is a left anti-globalization that, as I said, goes way back to the environmentalists and stuff. I wrote first about globalization and free trade in 1989 at Greenpeace. And then 10 years later, there's the Seattle thing. So I come out of kind of that environmental anti-globalization tradition. And they haven't done as well, but actually in the last election, Bernie Sanders and the left and stuff in the Democratic Party has become played an important role. And so the left anti-globalization is coming kind of more into its own. The left has many problems, but still, I think the left globalization is an important, anti-globalization is an important feature going forward. And I expect it to, do better in coming years.
Left, like those progressive we're talking about, and then the Tea Party can have similar views about globalization.
Well, they have very different reasons for being anti-globalization in some ways, but and their solutions to it are very different. The conservative, the Tea Party, Trump stuff is a protectionist, isolationist kind of nationalism, which has a long history, in terms of economic reactions to economic crises during the Great Depression, and around the world. That was probably the common response to, and kind of fascist leanings and that kind of thing. The left also has had responses to globalization, but their strategies are very different. And the main difference is that if you look at the difference between Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and Trump and stuff, is that Occupy Wall Street says we are the 99%. We believe in an inclusive movement to change the capitalism or democracy for a majority of people, so that it's not just Jeff Bezos and people going to Mars. It's like there's widespread sharing and moving forward. The conservative, the Tea Party, on the other hand, say no, we want to make change, but for us. And we're maybe not the 1% or the 10%, but the 30 or 40%. And the rest of you guys are just leeches. And, we want to move forward, but there's many undeserving people. So that shapes a very different sort of political thing. Now, the problem with most political commentaries, they said, well, these are both populist. And they're just two sides of the same coin, the Janus face of, whatever. And I don't believe that for a minute. I think populism is an incredibly inaccurate depiction of political movements in the contemporary period.
How do you set a sort of a balance between ameliorating the damages and flaws of globalization that you identify without provoking the damages and flaws caused by economic nationalism? If a retreat from globalization means a return to economic nationalism, it solves some problems, but it also creates some that we've experienced during those periods of greater monopolization, greater government subsidies to favored national corporations and to the elite classes of those corporations, higher cost of living, therefore lower living standards and higher poverty, in exchange for a better life for a very specific cloistered group of workers, who then tend to become a protected group of workers who tend to be white and privileged. So there's a danger of an increase in both poverty rates and racial inequality under economic nationalism. How do you balance that? Are you in favor of a type of globalization that's well regulated, or do you think that economic nationalism can be managed?
Well, I'm not an economic nationalist. I mean, I don't think that that's the way to go. I think you do have to have some sort of balanced kind of approach to that. I mean, so for example, I mean, one of the biggest imbalances that's at the heart of the China upsurge and is at the heart of the conflict between the United States and the rest of the world and China is that China, there is no level playing field when it comes to currencies, and China has its own protected currency, so it's it's a monetary nationalist, and if they played by the rules that other people played at, let's say the currencies are convertible and they're exchangeable and so on, and you can't manipulate them in the way that they do, then that would solve a lot of problems, because then all of a sudden the yuan, the renminbi would go up, their stuff wouldn't be as cheap, and then people could outsource stuff to other places, not just China. That's an example of how you could do that without simply reverting to everybody battling for their own currencies and engaging in competitive devaluations and the kind of stuff that went on during the Great Depression. Diplomacy and integration is a good thing. I would defend the EU against efforts to break it up. For example, I don't believe, I'm anti-separatist and so on, which is a form of economic or political nationalism. And I think there's a lot of value in promoting both political integration and economic integration, so long as it's done in a democratic way rather than this, market-driven, crazy, Wall Street model.
Well, you sold me on your book.
Oh, good. There we go. Another sale.
Order it, After Globalization by Robert Schaeffer. Yeah.
Hallelujah.
I just wonder if anybody else has a book that you want to flog here. I think Jim Ranney has one that he's always interested in promoting, but it doesn't necessarily have much to do with this discussion, does it, Jim?
It's a topic that used to be raised about 50, 60 years ago, but it's fallen into desuetude.
World Peace Through Law, yeah, which is a misnomer because you're not really talking about international law. You're talking about international tribunals or not mediation, but arbitration, which is the opposite.
The actual term is international dispute resolution. I posit that is the answer, international alternative dispute resolution. In America, people who are lawyers, refer to it as ADR, alternative dispute resolution, including mediation and arbitration. But to apply it to the international level, you add even adjudication would be an alternative to war.
I think it's really a contrast between international law on the sense that we've been trying to develop it and this arbitration approach. Now, if you were to try to apply it today to any current conflict, and any conflict, you pick one in the world now, and you try to imagine that both sides would accept the outcome of any kind of arbitration scheme that you would set up. I challenge you, because I don't think you can find a single case where you can say both sides would be willing to accept the outcome of any conceivable arbitrator that you might pick.
Yeah, I discuss at length in chapter 10 of my book how world peace through law, the concept, might apply in the real world, both to past historical instances like World War I and World War II and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to current pending conflicts. And it is true that it doesn't apply by its terms to civil wars, which are the most frequent kind of wars that we have nowadays. but some of the principles that are applicable international dispute resolution could apply, and it has been used in civil wars to solve them. Hundreds of them have been solved.
We've been talking about how China and the U.S. are going to toe-to-toe more. How are you going to resolve that with arbitration?
Well, it's already been applied down in the South Sea. There was a presentation made before the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is a little bit different than what I'm talking about. But nevertheless, the Chinese, of course, did not accept it. They did not appear. They did not accept the resulting decision. I think it was a 550-page decision. But the court, or the arbitration panel, found against China. What effect that will have, who knows? All I'm saying is that in the future, we need a world. We're either going to eventually apply international dispute resolution concepts, or we're going to end the world. In other words, either we're going to end all major wars, or humanity is doomed. And that means we need international alternative dispute resolution. International dispute resolution, I argue in my book, is actually a 4-stage process, starting with compulsory negotiation, which 2 historians have said probably would have solved World War I, would have prevented World War I. That might have been worth doing. Stage 2 is international compulsory mediation. If countries don't even have, the whole world does not have to agree with it. You could have just the US and the USSR, or US and Russia, agree to that. Because we hold over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world, that would be incredibly significant. International mediation is the most important concept in the whole book. It would solve 98% of all conflicts, and it's not intrusive upon international sovereignty. The 2 countries just have to agree upon a mediator, and then the mediator has no power to bind either party, can merely make suggestions. In fact, what I argue in my book is that what's called advisory arbitration. Advisory arbitration is like you go through as if you're having an arbitration, and distinguished panelists reach a certain result, but it's not binding yet. It's not a real pie in the sky, crazy notion. It's not something that we have to wait for pacifism to suddenly solve all our problems, or world federalism to solve all our problems. It could be adopted, or at least portions of it could be adopted immediately.
If people were close enough to sharing the same values that they could actually agree that, yeah, you pick this guy to be the mediator or this arbitrator, and I'll take his word for it. But I don't think that happens very often. I think, especially in situations where people really have very contradictory positions, that it would be extremely difficult to find somebody that both sides would accept. And I mean, if you look at any fights that you've personally had, and I have fights. I have one going on now that I can't imagine any mediator who's going to be able to solve it just because we're so far apart. So if that's the reality, it's a beautiful idea, but I don't, are you going to get anywhere with it? I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know either. In predictions in advance, I think by either side are pointless. It is true, you've made some very perceptive critiques of the basic concept as to whether people would be willing to accept it. But like you gave the example of China and US, there are some very specific potential pending disputes. Mm-hmm. Taiwan, the whole South Sea, claims that are made by China, all those things. And all I say in the book is that it'd be much, much better to resolve them by international dispute resolution mechanisms than by war. Mm-hmm. If we and China get into a war, we can probably kiss the whole earth goodbye.
Well, I agree, for sure.
Scientists have done studies to show that 100 nuke exchange between 2 little countries like Pakistan and India could probably wipe out agriculture for 10 years, meaning the death of humans at least.
Well, I think that developing international law is more likely to bring us to the point that nations actually would have to say, if it's against international law, I guess we can't do it. So let's pack it in and accept defeat. I think international law is more promising as a way to go than trying to promote alternative dispute resolution of the kind that you've suggested.
Well, you have much more optimism about international law, which I taught twice, than I do. For one thing, almost all of these disputes, Ukraine, the dispute elsewhere, there have been law professors, deans, in fact, of law schools that have suggested that international law really isn't that much help. We think of it as this very sophisticated thing, but it's still in a very primitive stage of development. Yeah. And so it's part of the system. It's the fourth stage, is compulsory adjudication, which, by the way, Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to that. An article that was published in one British newspaper, in 0 American newspapers, in 0 Canadian newspapers, and you can look it up. His whole speech, in which he agreed to it in 1987. Then it was discussed for a couple of years, but then it's been largely forgotten. Okay. It's true. The bully boys of the world, like the U.S. and Russia and China, would have to agree that they're going to forego the guilty little pleasures that they've had in the past of engaging in actions like Crimea and mining Nicaraguan harbors and doing other kinds of acts that are basically aggression under international law.
Yeah, you're right.
They have to forego those pleasures in order to have a world that's safe for humanity.
You're right. I think we're going to have to end this so your friend back there with the clarinet could practice. Hello, friend with the clarinet.
She's pretty good on the clarinet.
I wanted to ask the question. Why are there so many criticizing Biden for drawing from Afghanistan and Iraq? It was Trump, really, and he's just completing the withdrawal. But why? I mean, it's a failed war. It makes no sense. What's the other way around here? Because I am completely supportive of him withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. Okay, but how can humanity? How can the international community stop the Taliban? Is there a way to stop that?
No, there isn't. Robert, do you think there is?
I think the Taliban has its limits, and there are people in Afghanistan who fought them successfully in the first phase, and may well do so again now. I mean, the Taliban never actually took over all of Afghanistan, so I doubt they'll be able to do it again. But so that's the the internal opposition to the Taliban will exist, I think, which means the war there will go on as a civil war for a long time.
Well, okay. So with that cheery observation, I think we've more than used up our time, and it's going to be hard to edit because there's nothing I want to take out from this conversation. But I'm going to have to trim off about 5 minutes of it. So it's been fun, and I'm delighted that you guys have been with me today. And so I'm going to say goodbye.
Nice meeting you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.